Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Margaret Harris lecture on religion. As you know, probably, this lecture was instituted in 1965 and named after an early benefactress of University College Dundee, Margaret Harris. And her estate not only endowed our first chair of physics, but also our University Chaplaincy Centre. Now, it gives me great pleasure this evening to extend a very warm welcome to Professor John Lennox, currently one of academia's leading champions of Christianity, who offers an exceptionally thought-provoking re-evaluation of the relation of science and religion. And he casts a welcome new light on many of today's major debates. Now, John is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University, a Fellow in Philosophy of Science at Green College, Oxford. He was born in Northern Ireland. I won't go all the way through, John, don't worry. I'll jump quickly, then he went to Cambridge University, from which he holds the degrees MA and PhD. He then was subsequently Reader in Pure Mathematics at the University of Wales, where he was awarded Doctor of Science. Now, in addition to this, if that's not enough, he holds an MA in Bioethics. Now, John has written many articles and several books on mathematics and Christian apologetics, and his lecture tours take him all round the world. He's debated many of the world's leading atheists, including Christopher Hitchens and the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, and he did this in Alabama, USA, and also in Oxford. If we are to believe many modern commentators, then science has squeezed God into a corner, killed and then buried him with its all-embracing explanations. Professor Lennox invites us to consider this claim very carefully. And he poses the question, could it be possible that theism sits more comfortably with science than atheism? Now, after writing his book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Yes, I have props. Professor Lennox is now taking on the physicists, and one in particular, a scientist whom he admired since his student days at Cambridge, Stephen Hawking. A couple of months ago, Hawking made international headlines with the proposition that God has not, after all, created the universe, and science has made philosophy redundant. Now, as an academic, a scientist, a believer in the Christian faith, John is not a man to let Hawking's go unchallenged. In fact, John positively welcomes the opportunity to engage in informed debate, whether it's in the deep south of America or in the darkest recesses of our own student union, where just this afternoon he debated with a lively and challenging panel of students and another large gathering of students. Now, I have to say, you survived unscathed, but our students were very interested to meet the person described in the Times newspaper last week as Christianity's new poster boy. Oh, I wanted to say that, John. John, we're honoured to have you here, and we are delighted to welcome you to our university. I should say at this point that this is a special evening in many ways because John's new book, God and Stephen Hawking, whose design is it anyway, is actually not out yet till January, but we had a special print of it just for tonight. So we only have 125 copies downstairs. So feel free to crowd downstairs afterwards. John, I now invite you to deliver our 2010 Margaret Harris Lecture on Religion, entitled A Matter of Gravity, God, the Universe, and Stephen Hawking. John.
Vice-Chancellor, Chaplain, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I think you must take the Times comment with a pinch of salt, because it also described me as plump and untidy. And since clearly neither of those two epithets describe me, you can take not too seriously indeed. I see, incidentally, that I am not like the bishop who turned up in a country church at the invitation of the vicar, and as he climbed into the pulpit, he noticed there were only 2 people in the audience. And he whispered to the vicar as he mounted the pulpit steps, he said, "Did you tell them I was coming?" And the vicar said, "No, but word seems to have got around." I feel greatly honoured to be invited to give this lecture. I met, as you've heard, with students at lunchtime, and I was very impressed with their friendliness and the quality of their minds. And if they are a sample of what Dundee is doing, I think the Vice-Chancellor and his colleagues can be immensely proud. People from different societies, the Atheist Society, the Christian Union, various international societies, all blending together and open for vigorous discussion. And I thought that the lunchtime was a wonderful preparation for tonight's lecture. Now, a very powerful voice has been added to the atheist choir, that of physicist Stephen Hawking. Around the world, the headlines were full of it. Oh.
That's it. There we go.
Right. Oh, that's much better, isn't it? Yes. I now exist. A very powerful voice has been added to the atheist choir, physicist Stephen Hawking. The headlines around the world were full of it. Stephen Hawking says physics leaves no room for God. And the headlines were referring to the publication of a new book by Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow, The Grand Design. It raced immediately to the top of the bestseller charts, because the public confession of atheism by a man of such high intellectual profile as Hawking has had the instant effect of ratcheting up the debate by several notches. It has also, of course, sold a large number of books. Well, what are we to think? Is that it then? Is there nothing more to say? Should all clerics resign and all churches close? Has the grand master of physics checkmated the grand designer of the universe? It certainly is a grandiose claim to have banished God. After all, the majority of great scientists in the past have believed in him, and many still do. Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Clerk Maxwell, to name a few. Were they really all wrong on the God question? Now, Stephen Hawking is arguably the world's most famous living scientist. He has recently retired from the Lucasian Professorship in Cambridge, a chair once held by Sir Isaac Newton. He has occupied that position with great distinction. He has been made a Companion of Honour by Her Majesty the Queen. He has also been an outstanding symbol of fortitude, having suffered the ravages of motor neurone disease for over 40 years. And for many of these, he has been confined to a wheelchair with his only means of verbal communication a specially designed electronic voice synthesizer, whose instantly recognizable voice is known all over the world. And in a runaway bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Hawking brought the recondite world of fundamental physics to the coffee table, although many people have confessed to finding the contents rather beyond them. It has been called the most unread book in history. This book was followed by several others in the same vein, which attempted successfully to excite a wider readership with the buzz of great science. Now, since his books deal with the origin of the universe, it is inevitable that he should consider the matter of the existence of a divine creator. A Brief History of Time left this matter tantalizingly open by ending with the much-quoted statement that if physicists were to find a theory of everything, that is, a theory that unified the 4 fundamental forces of nature, we would know the mind of God. Now, in this latest book, Hawking's reticence has disappeared, and he challenges belief in the divine creation of the universe. According to him, It is the laws of physics, not the will of God, that provide the real explanation as to how the universe came into being. The Big Bang, he argues, was the inevitable consequence of these laws. I quote, "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." Now, the title, The Grand Design, will suggest for many people the existence of a grand designer, but that is actually what the book is designed to deny. Hawking's grand conclusion is spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why I exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touchmaker and set the universe going. Now, I wish to engage this evening not with Hawking's science, but with what he claims to deduce from it regarding the existence, or rather the non-existence, of God. Over the years, of course, other scientists have made similar claims, maintaining that the awesome, sophisticated complexity of the world around us can be interpreted solely by reference to the basic stuff of the universe, mass energy, or to the physical laws that describe its behavior, such as the law of gravity. Hawking now joins such scientists. And his book opens with a list of the big questions that people have asked through the ages. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Now, when one reads these questions emanating from such a famous person, the imagination is instantly excited with the anticipation of hearing a world-class scientist give his insights on some of the profoundest questions of philosophy. Well, if that is what we expect, we're in for a slight shock, because in his next words, Hawking dismisses philosophy. Referring to his list of questions, he writes, "Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." Now, apart from the unwarranted hubris of this dismissal of philosophy, a discipline which is well represented in his own University of Cambridge, it constitutes, to my mind, rather disturbing evidence that at least one scientist, Hawking himself, not only has not kept up with philosophy, but ironically does not appear to realize that his own book is largely concerned with philosophical questions. Firstly, his statement that philosophy is dead is itself a philosophical statement. And that is going to be a kind of leitmotif, ladies and gentlemen, for my logical analysis of his arguments this evening. But the view that scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery is not far removed from the philosophical view called scientism, the view that science is the only way to truth. That is a conviction characteristic of the secular movement known as the New Atheism, although its ideas are mostly only new in the aggressive way they are presented rather than in their intellectual content. For any scientist, let alone a science superstar, to disparage philosophy on the one hand and then at once to adopt a self-contradictory philosophical stance on the other is not the wisest way to begin a book. Nobel laureate Sir Peter Medawar pointed this out long ago in his excellent book, Advice to a Young Scientist, that ought to be compulsory reading for all scientists. "There is no quicker way," he writes, "for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and upon his profession than roundly to declare, particularly when no declaration of any kind is called for, that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking, and that questions which do not admit a scientific answer are in some way non-questions or pseudo-questions that only simpletons ask and only the gullible profess to be able to answer." Medawar goes on to say, "The existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? He adds that we must turn to imaginative literature and religion for the answers to such questions. Now, it seems to me that this point that science has its limits is extremely important. And I speak as someone who's passionate about science. I like to imagine it this way. Here's my Aunt Matilda, and she's baked a beautiful cake, and all of you are Nobel Prize winners. And I invite you to analyze the cake. So the chemist will tell us about its elements, and the biochemist will tell us something else. The physicists will reduce it to quarks and leptons, and the mathematicians will say nothing because there isn't a Nobel Prize in mathematics. But suppose we've got a wonderful scientific analysis of this cake. And then I say, now, ladies and gentlemen, Nobel Prize winners all, just before you go, I have a further question for you. Why did she make the cake? And she begins to grin, because of course she knows. But you can see immediately, can't you, that unless she reveals it to us, we shall never know. Not by the most profound scientific analysis, including the scanning of her brain. It's pretty obvious that, isn't it? And yet when she does let us know, we shall use our rationality to see if what she reveals to us makes sense. That's a very simple illustration, but it helps to answer another contemporary confusion in this whole debate, that the idea of revelation is somehow anti-reason. It's not with Aunt Matilda. We use our reason on the world about us, on the cake. We also use our reason on what is revealed to us by Aunt Matilda. And of course, the early scientists who believed in God's two books, the book of nature and the book of his word, thought the same way. They used their reason on both because both can be regarded as sources of information. And it seems to be important that we do not think that people like myself, who stand in the Christian tradition, are shutting their brains when it comes to the understanding of what claims to be revelation. Science is limited, and Francis Collins, director of the National Institute of Health and former director of the Human Genome Project, is very clear on it. Science is powerless to answer questions such as, why did the universe come into being? What is the meaning of human existence? What happens after we die? So there's clearly no inconsistency in being a scientist at the highest level, passionate about the subject, and recognizing that science has its limits. In fact, many scientists would confess that part of the power and success of science is because it limits itself to a certain grid of questions. Now, Hawking's inadequate view of philosophy soon shows itself in an inadequate view of God. He writes, ignorance of nature's ways led people in ancient times to invent gods to lord it over every aspect of human life. He then says that this began with ancient Greek thinkers like Thales of Miletus about 2,600 years ago. The idea arose, he writes, that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered, and so began the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday learn to read. Hawking is surely not expecting us, is he, to fall for the common trick of rubbishing religion by rubbishing primitive concept of God. Yet whether deliberately or not, he confuses God with the gods. And that inevitably leads him to a view of God as a God of the gaps who can be displaced by scientific advance. The kind of idea there is, once we thought that thunder was the voice of the gods, but now we've studied electricity and air movements and so on, and we now have a scientific explanation. And so as science advances, God retreats until he eventually disappears. But that view of God is not found in Christianity or any major monotheistic religion. where God is not a God of the gaps. He is the author of the whole show. Nor, incidentally, is he the God of the deists who lit the blue touch paper to start the universe going and then retired to a vast distance. God both created the universe and constantly sustains it in existence. Without him, there would be nothing for physicists like Stephen Hawking to study. And in particular, God is the creator both of the bits of the universe we don't understand and the bits that we do. And of course, when we think about it, it is the bits of the universe we do understand that give the most evidence of God's existence and activity. Just as our admiration of the genius behind a work of art or engineering increases the more we understand it, so my worship of the Creator increases the more I understand the universe he has created. So that when Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravity, he did not say, now I know how it was done, I don't need God. No, he wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, Principia Mathematica, hoping that a thinking person would, as a result of it, come to believe in a deity. It was in that same spirit that James Clerk Maxwell, who, according to Einstein, is second after Newton in the history of science as a towering intellectual figure, had carved on his Cavendish laboratory in Cambridge, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out by those who delight in them." Now, one of the main conclusions of the grand design is this. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, the first question to ask, I think, is what does Hawking mean by nothing? Because the first part of the statement is, because there is a law of gravity. So Hawking assumes, therefore, that a law of gravity exists. And one might presume also that he assumes that gravity itself exists, for the simple reason that an abstract mathematical law on its own would be vacuous with nothing to describe, a point to which I shall return. But the main issue for now is this: the law of gravity is not nothing. And if Hawking is using the word nothing in its usually philosophically correct sense of non-being, there's something very strange going on here. So on the face of it, and this is one of the central statements in the book, it seems to me, Hawking seems to be simultaneously asserting that the universe is both created from nothing and from something. Now, one might add for good measure that when physicists talk about nothing, and I don't mean you to misunderstand that, when physicists talk about nothing, they often appear to be in a quantum vacuum, which is manifestly not nothing. In fact, Hawking is surely alluding to this when he writes, "We are a product of quantum fluctuations in the very early universe." I sometimes wonder whether this might be a little bit too much ado about nothing. But the situation does not appear to improve when we move on to the logic of the second part of his statement. The universe can and will create itself. Now, if we say X creates Y, ordinary language would tell us that we're presupposing the existence of X to bring Y into existence. That's a simple matter of what the words X creates Y mean. Now, if therefore we say X creates X, we're presupposing the existence of X in order to account for the existence of X. This is so obviously self-contradictory and also logically incoherent, even if we put X equal to the universe. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you this evening that to presuppose the existence of the universe to account for its own existence is something out of Alice in Wonderland, not science. Now, it is very seldom in my experience to find in one single statement two distinct levels of contradiction. But Hawking seems to have invented such a statement. He says the universe comes from a nothing that turns out to be a something. And then he says that the universe creates itself. But this, fascinatingly, is not all. His notion that the law of gravity explains the existence of the universe is also self-contradictory, since a law of nature by definition surely presupposes the existence of the nature it purports to describe. I find it fascinating that in this book, which says philosophy is dead, its key statement contains a triple self-contradiction. Philosophers just might be tempted to comment. That is what comes of saying philosophy is dead. Now, Hawking here echoes Peter Atkins, a colleague at Oxford, a well-known atheist, who believes that space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. Atkins dubs this the cosmic bootstrap principle, referring to the self-contradictory idea of a person lifting himself by pulling on his own bootlaces. Philosopher of religion Keith Ward is surely right to say that Atkins' view of the universe is as blatantly self-contradictory as the name he gives to it, pointing out that it is logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. Ward concludes, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there's no competition. We were always right to think that persons or universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. What perhaps all this goes to show is that nonsense remains nonsense even when talked by world-famous scientists. But what serves to obscure the illogicality of such statements is the fact that they are made by famous scientists, and the general public, not surprisingly, assumes that they are statements of science and takes them on that authority. And that is why I think it's important to point out, and I apply the same to myself, that not all statements by scientists are statements of science. And any statement, whether made by a scientist or not, should be open to logical analysis, because immense prestige and authority do not compensate for faulty logic. Now, the worrying thing I find is that this illogical notion of the universe creating itself is not some peripheral point in the grand design. It appears to be the key argument. And if the key argument is invalid, in one sense, there's nothing more to say. But since the laws of gravity play such a role in Hawking's argument, it might be important also to comment on the nature of law, because so far as I can see, there are serious misunderstandings lying what he says about this. Because his faulty concept of God as a God of the gaps now has the very serious consequence of leading him to present before the public a choice between God and science, or more accurately in his case, a choice between the God and the laws of physics. Now, of course, if you think more science, less God, that is an inevitable consequence of the logic of his argument. Talking about M theory, his chosen candidate for a unifying theory of physics, he said, M theory predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. Their creation does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, these multiple universes arise naturally from physical law. Now, a supernatural being or God is an agent who does something. In the case of the God of Christianity, he is a personal agent. Dismissing such an agent, Hawking ascribes creative power to physical law. But physical law is not an agent. Hawking, it seems to me, is making a classical category mistake by confusing two entirely different kinds of entity, physical law and personal agency. In other words, the choice he faces us with is a choice between false alternatives, because it confuses two levels of explanation, agency and law. Suppose, to make matters clearer, we replace the universe by a jet engine, and we are asked to explain it. Shall we account for it by mentioning the personal agency of its inventor, Sir Frank Whittle? Or shall we, following Hawking, dismiss personal agency and explain the jet engine by saying it arose naturally from physical law? Now, this would be absurd. It is obvious we need both levels of explanation in order to give a complete description. It is also obvious that the scientific explanation neither conflicts nor competes with the agent explanation. They complement one another. It is the same with explanations of the universe. God does not conflict or compete with the laws of physics as an explanation. God is actually the ground of all explanation, in the sense that he is the ultimate cause in the first place of there being a world for the laws of physics to describe. Now, there's more to this, because the laws of physics can explain how the jet engine works, but not how it came to exist in the first place. The jet engine needed the intelligence and creative engineering work of Whittle. Indeed, come to think of it, the laws of physics plus Frank Whittle could not actually produce a jet engine on their own. There also needed to be some material subject to those laws that could be worked on by Whittle. Matter, ladies and gentlemen, may be humble stuff, but it is not produced by laws. Now, the example of the jet engine can help us clear up another confusion. Science, according to many scientists, concentrates essentially on material causation. It asks the how questions. How does the jet engine work? It asks the why question regarding function. Why is this valve here? Why is that microprocessor there? But it does not ask the why question of purpose. Why was the jet engine built? What is important here is that the name Sir Frank Whittle doesn't appear in the scientific account. To quote Laplace, the scientific account has no need of that hypothesis because of what it is. But it would be very ridiculous to deduce from that that Whittle didn't exist, because he is the answer to the question, why does the jet engine exist in the first place? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that all of you have noticed that scientists did not put the universe there. Nor did their theories, nor did the laws of mathematical physics. Yet Hawking seems to think they did. When asked where gravity came from, he said, M theory. But to say that a theory or physical laws could bring the universe or anything at all for that matter into existence is to understand what theory is. Now, scientists love developing theories involving mathematical laws to describe natural phenomena, which enable them to make predictions, and they've done it with spectacular success. But most are aware, I think, that on their own the theories and laws that they find cannot create anything, let alone a universe. Our physical laws are a description, usually mathematical, of what normally happens under certain given conditions. This is surely obvious from the very first example that Hawking gives in his book. The sun rises in the east. But this law does not create the sun, nor the planet Earth with east and west. It is descriptive and predictive, but not creative. Similarly, Newton's laws of gravitation doesn't create gravity or the matter in which gravity acts. In fact, it doesn't even explain gravity, as Newton himself realized. But it's even worse, or better, depending on your point of view. The laws of physics cannot even cause anything to happen. Newton's celebrated laws of motion never caused a pool ball to race across the table. That can only be done by people using a pool cue and the action of their muscles. Now, one can understand what is meant by saying that the behavior of the universe is law-like and governed by the laws of nature. But what can Hawking possibly mean by saying the universe arises naturally from physical law? Now, another example of this basic misunderstanding of law is given by the well-known physicist Paul Davies, with whom I had a fascinating radio debate recently. There's no need, he says, to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I have never liked the idea of divine tinkering. For me, it is much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into being. However, in the world in which I live, the simple law of arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 2, never brought anything into being. I wish it did. It never has put any money into my bank account. If I put £1,000 into the bank today and later another £1,000, the laws of arithmetic will rationally explain how it is that I now have £2,000 in the bank. But if I never put any money into the bank myself and simply leave it to the laws of arithmetic to bring money into being, I shall be permanently bankrupt. C.S. Lewis, with usual brilliance, grasped this years ago. The laws of nature produce no events. They state the pattern to which every event, if only it can be induced to happen, must conform. Just as the rules of arithmetic state the pattern to which all transactions with money must conform. If only you can get a hold of any money. Thus, in one sense, the laws of nature cover the whole field of space and time. In another, what they leave out is precisely the whole real universe. The incessant torrent of actual events, which makes up true history, that must come from somewhere else. To think the laws can produce it is like thinking that you can create real money by simply doing sums. For every law says in the last resort, if you have A, then you will get B. But first catch your A. The laws will not do it for you. I submit to you that the world of strict naturalism in which clever mathematical laws all by themselves bring the universe and life into existence is pure science fiction. Theories and laws do not do so. And therefore, Stephen Hawking, it seems to me, has signally failed to answer the central question he raises. Why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, widely regarded as the father of modern astronomy, discoverer of quasars, winner of the Crawford Prize, astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, is in no doubt about his answer to the question. I find it quite improbable, he says, that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. But let me come now to the grand design, because like every other physicist, Hawking is confronted with powerful evidence of design in the fine-tuning of the universe. He explains, our universe and its laws appear to have a design that both is tailor-made to support us and, if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained and raises the natural question of why it is that way. The discovery relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could lead at least some of us back to the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. Hawking, therefore, recognizes a grand design. He devotes almost an entire chapter to giving extensive details of that fine-tuning, impressive evidence. And it certainly fits in with what he calls the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. Of course it does. It fits like a glove, because there actually is a grand designer. Now, the idea of a grand designer is certainly old, but the important question to ask is whether or not it is true. Simply to say it is old can give the erroneous impression that what is old is necessarily false. It has been superseded. Secondly, it can give the further erroneous impression that no one holds it today. But some of the finest minds in science, at least one Nobel Prize winner in physics, does hold it. The conviction that there is a grand designer is one of the major convictions in the history of human thought. That does not, of course, prove it's true, but it certainly means it's worthy of our serious consideration. Now, Hawking goes therefore too far in saying that is not the answer of modern science. There are scientists who believe it, there are scientists who do not. But his answer is what he calls the multiverse. And that is the idea that there are several many-world scenarios and many universes, some suggest infinitely many, whatever that means. That anything that can happen will happen in some universe, so it's not surprising that at least one universe is like ours. So now we come to the second set of false alternatives, God or the multiverse. But as leading philosophers have pointed out, from a theoretical perspective, why shouldn't God be responsible for the multiverse? The notion that there is a multiverse does not per se exclude a creator. Hawking doesn't seem to mention this at all. But with the multiverse, Hawking moves out beyond science into the realm of philosophy, whose death he has announced rather prematurely. As Paul Davies points out, all cosmological models are constructed by augmenting the results of observation by some sort of philosophical principle. Now, Hawking here claiming to be the voice of modern science on the issue gives a false impression where the multiverse is concerned, since there are very weighty voices within science that do not support his view. Prominent among them, Sir Roger Penrose, Hawking's former collaborator, who shared with him the distinguished Wolf Prize. Of Hawking's use of the multiverse concept in the grand design, Penrose recently said, "It's overused, and this is a place where it's overused. It's an excuse for not having a good theory." That's an immensely strong statement, isn't it? I am tempted to believe, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll forgive me, that belief in God seems to be a much more rational option if the alternative is to believe that every other universe that can possibly exist does exist, including one in which Richard Dawkins is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Christopher Hitchens the Pope, and Billy Graham has just been voted Atheist of the Year. Now, to be serious once more, but perhaps I was being serious, Hawking's ultimate theory to explain why the laws of physics are as they are is called M-theory, a theory of supersymmetric gravity that involves very sophisticated concepts such as vibrating strings in 11 dimensions. Hawking confidently calls it the unified theory that Einstein was expecting to find. Now, if it is, and I'm not in a position to judge it, it would be a triumph of mathematical physics. But for the reasons given above, far from administering the death blow to God, it will give us even more insight into his creatorial wisdom. Don Page, a theoretical physicist from the University of Alberta, who's a former student of Hawking and has co-authored 8 papers with him, says, and he gave me permission to quote his letter to me, he says, "I certainly would agree that even if M-theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe." So although it does not affect my argument this evening at all, ladies and gentlemen, it should just be noted that not all physicists are as convinced as Hawking about the validity of M-theory. Roger Penrose says it's very far from any testability. And he says the grand design is a bit misleading. It gives you this impression of a theory that's going to explain everything. It's nothing of the sort. It is not even a theory. Indeed, in Penrose's estimation, M-theory was hardly science. Now, please notice, Penrose's criticisms are scientific, not theological. He is, in fact, a member of the British Humanist Association. Tim Radford did a wonderful review of the grand design. In this very brief history of modern cosmological physics, the laws of quantum and relativistic physics represent things to be wondered at, but widely accepted, just like biblical miracles. M-theory invokes something different, a prime mover, a begetter, a creative force that is everywhere and nowhere. This force cannot be identified by instruments or examined by comprehensible mathematical prediction, and yet it contains all possibilities. It incorporates omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and it's a big mystery. Remind you of anybody? I move to advance the cause of atheism by means of a highly speculative, untestable theory that is not within the zone of evidence-based science, and which, even if it were true, could not dislodge God in any case, is not exactly calculated to impress. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, much of the rationale behind Hawking's argument lies in the idea that there's a deep-seated conflict between science and religion. That is not a discord I recognize. For me, as a Christian believer, the beauty of the scientific description of the universe reinforces my faith in an intelligent divine creator. Indeed, the very reason that science flourished so vigorously in the 16th and 17th centuries under men like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton had a great deal to do with their conviction that the laws of nature reflected the influence of a divine lawgiver. Far from belief in God hindering science, it was arguably the motor that drove it. Now, the fact that science is a rational activity, or mainly so, helps us to identify another flaw, as I see it in Hawking's thinking. Like Francis Crick, he wants us to believe that we human beings are nothing but mere collections of fundamental particles of nature. Hawking reduces biology to physics and chemistry and concludes, it is hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. Now that's a debate to introduce in the last 3 minutes of a lecture in Scotland. But let me content myself by citing a comment on the implications of this kind of determinism by Sir John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum physics at Cambridge years ago. He says this, in the opinion of many thinkers, human freedom is closely connected with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claim that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper be simply the actions of automata? All proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic Marx, or sexual Freud, or genetic Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal. Hawking's name, I think, could reasonably be therefore added to that list. It seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the principal objection to all of this is not so much theological. It's that this reductionist view undermines the very rationality that we need to do science. I do not see a conflict between science and religion as such, but I do see a conflict. The conflict lies at the deeper level of worldview. And so far as tonight's lecture is concerned, it is the diametrical opposition between the worldview of materialism and the worldview of theism, materialism stroke naturalism, if you like. And right from the ancient world, we've been presented with these two worldviews. The ancient Greek thinkers, brilliant, Leucippus and Democritus, who gave us the atomic theory, thought that there were two things, essentially, atoms and the void, and as the atoms poured through the void, they created stars, the universe, the world, and life. The other worldview, which was supported by Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, was that this material universe is not all that exists. There is God or the gods. And so those two views come barreling up towards us and find themselves now of great interest in the Academy, as your presence here this evening indicates. So I do see a conflict. It is a conflict between these two worldviews, but I want you to notice there are scientists on each side of it. Science, as the chaplain said in her introduction, I want to argue, sits much less comfortably with atheism than it does with theism. The materialistic worldview tells me in the end that my mind is my brain, and it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Why then, as Darwin himself worried, why then should it tell me truth? On the other hand, there is another worldview, and that says that the reason that the scientist can understand in her mind something of the universe out there is that ultimately the origin of both goes back to an intelligent creator. So we're faced with two worldviews. One starts in the beginning with mass energy, the particles, and everything is derivative, including information. The other says the exact opposite. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. So in the first worldview, mass energy is primary and mind is derivative. In the other worldview, mind is primary and mass energy is derivative. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not simply my Christianity, but my science that leads me to prefer that view to the atheist view. And perhaps I stand in Dundee tonight. I have a fond hope that the founding fathers of this distinguished university deliberately gave it its motto, which in Latin reads, Magnificat anima mea Dominum. My soul does magnify the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Now it's your turn. And we're going to do something to which you may not be used, because in a large audience like this, it's fascinating to me to find out what kind of questions are buzzing around in your minds. Now is the time for questions, not for mini lectures or lengthy statements. We haven't got a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to have a couple of microphones running around, and I'm going to collect a number of questions before I look at any of them, so that we get some idea of what various people are thinking. So if you've got a question, put up your hand, the microphone will see you, and make it as clear and short as possible. I will write it down, and then when I think we've got enough questions, I will try to answer them. So.
Richard Carr, I would like to ask the question whether Hawkins has considered the philosophical question or statement that man can ask the question whether God exists, but that man can't answer it.
Okay. That's number one. Thank you. Number two.
You've posed in a very didactic manner two alternatives, theism or atheism. I would prefer agnosticism, saying that we really don't know and cannot know what lies behind, and that this gives us a sense of the utter wonder and extraordinariness of the world without committing us to views which I would agree with you that atheism is absurd, but I also think theism, to me anyway, is deeply unsatisfactory.
Thank you
Why
very
can't we
much
just
indeed.
be content not to know and to meditate on the beauty of things such as it is?
Thank you very much. Next.
In a similar vein, I worry that your materialist and theist distinction, I wonder if you've considered instead that really, as in the history of philosophy up until this point, until you gave this lecture, the distinction was really materialist, idealist, and that to introduce a materialist theist dichotomy is a wrong thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Next. You can see, by the way, if I go on doing this for long enough, I won't have to answer any of them.
Mine was more just a simple statement. Why should the God debate actually matter to science? If you believe in God, that's a subjective thing. Science should carry on answering the questions as best it can, because if God comes into it, there's always a get-out clause, and you think that perhaps the God debate shouldn't matter to science that much.
Thank you. This is getting really interesting. Yeah, 5. I'm going to have to call a halt in a minute.
On the theory of relativity, beg your pardon, on the Big Bang theory, the
Yes.
theory of the Big Bang theory, what went bang?
What went bang? You know, when you give a lecture in Russia, ladies and gentlemen, they have a marvelous way of controlling you. When you're talking, they come up with written pages and they put them in front of you and bow. And the longer you go on, the greater the pile grows. Right, we'll have to stop now and have a look at some of these. Has Hawking considered the philosophical question, man can ask whether God exists but can't answer it? Well, I'm sorry, but I cannot know whether he's asked that question or not. I don't, from my recollection, seem to have read anything like that. It relates to one of the later questions, actually, as to what we can know and what we cannot know. And I'm going to link the two. The questioner raised the issue of theism or atheism. Why didn't I mention agnosticism? I could also have mentioned several other things, actually, sir. The limitations of time meant that I confined myself to what I see as the major polarization. But as you say, you don't seem to be very convinced by atheism. You think it's absurd. You think theism has problems. That means that you have reflected on both of them, and you've come to a conclusion. So the agnosticism is an attitude to those two worldviews. If you like, you can include agnosticism in the worldviews, because although most of us would admit that we are agnostic about many things, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I would not like you to go away with the impression that I am claiming some sort of universal knowledge. I think it is very important that we think like Newton did, and certainly I feel like it, that when he looked at the great amount of things lying out there, he said, I feel like a child playing on the sand with a few pebbles when an ocean of undiscovered truth lies before me. The interesting thing about that quotation is he believed there was truth out there to be perceived. And that, of course, even in a so-called postmodern age, is still a fundamental conviction of science. There is something out there to be grasped. Now, therefore, there are many things we don't know, but you went a step further, and you said there are things we cannot know. But that raises a little question of how you know we cannot know. And it seems to me that it reflects on something I hinted at in the lecture, which I hold for very important. And that is, as we think of epistemology and are getting to know things, when it comes to what I've been talking about, that is this: what can we read off the physical universe? It is very interesting that even within the Christian tradition, the Apostle Paul makes it very clear that what you can deduce from the physical universe is limited. In his famous statement, he says, from the beginning of creation, there are certain things we can perceive, not prove. You only get proof in mathematics, but can perceive in the things that are made, namely that there is a God, theotokos in Greek, which I take to mean that there is a God and that he is powerful. In other words, what we might call the natural revelation is limited. You have to bring other evidence to bear. Now, in this matter of what we can know and what we cannot know, we have to then raise inevitably the question, is there any aid to the human faculty of reason? Now, the point I made very briefly, and I would now illuminate it once more, is that my human reason can work on the natural world as it can work on Aunt Matilda's cake. I cannot know why she made the cake unless she reveals it. But if she reveals it to me, I would be rather absurd to suggest I cannot know it because my scientific investigation have not given me the answer to it. Now, that raises the very big question, which is not the topic of my lecture tonight except obliquely, as to whether there is a being who stands in the same relation to our universe as Aunt Matilda to the cake, and whether or not he has spoken. I believe he has, you see. So I would want to take in revelation that there are things that unaided reason cannot know, but they are revealed, and reason then works on them to understand what they're saying. It doesn't shut reason out. But what I take from what you say, and it's a very good corrective, and I am grateful to you for it, that it is very important that we never lose the sense of wonder. I do wish some of our kids had more of a sense of wonder at this universe, and anything we can do to increase that sense of wonder through science and art and so on is well worth doing. Now, a philosopher among us has asked, why did I not split between materialist and idealist? For the simple reason that if I was going to talk about idealism, I would want to contrast that not with materialism, but realism, which really stands at the opposite end of the perspective of that. And all I was wanting to say is that it seems to me, at the simplest initial level, that these two kinds of explanations of the universe, that is, that matter is all that exists, or that it is not all that exists, that there is a cause of it who is God. That's a rough and ready distinction. Now, what I should have said, and perhaps you would have been happier with this, was that there are not simply a couple of worldviews, there are a couple of families of worldviews. And there are subtle and important distinctions to be made between them. But since this wasn't a lecture on philosophy, I thought that saying simply what I did would be enough. Now, the Big Bang. What went bang? I haven't a notion what went bang. Remember, Fred Hoyle, he conjured up the words Big Bang as a joke. He didn't like the idea of a beginning to the universe at all. He held the view of the steady state. And so he was really mocking when he said a Big Bang. But I think it's very important that we realize that Big Bang is a label on a mystery. What it's saying from the perspective of the standard model of the universe is that there was a beginning to space-time. Now, that's the thing I find fascinating about it, because I'm old, ladies and gentlemen. I actually was alive in the 1960s, and some of you weren't. And I remember when the evidence started coming in for the hot Big Bang origin of the universe, and the way in which it was opposed by leading scientists, such as the editor of Nature, John Maddox, who says we must not give in to this notion of the Big Bang. Why? Because it will give too much leverage to people who believe in creation. And that was a very interesting thing to discover, a scientific advance being resisted because it fitted in with a biblical paradigm. So what I take from that, and Richard Dawkins and I had a bit of a spat on it, and I said, you know, the Bible got this right. It's been saying for centuries there was a beginning. Well, he said, what's in that? I mean, there's a 50% chance. But I said I didn't think scientists worked on the basis there had been a 50% chance. The question of introducing a singularity where space-time began was an immense effort that produced several Nobel Prizes, including Penzias and so on. So it's not as simple as that. And I simply made the point for people who think the Bible has nothing to say about the material universe. Remember, the Bible is not a textbook of science. But the things it says about the universe, though few in number, are highly significant. And one of them is the way it starts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is fascinating. How did they know it when it took them till 1960 to get a grasp of it? So then, so much for the Big Bang. A couple more questions and I will stop. Have I got a moment or two more? I have a few moments. This lady, you know, she's charming. But she is powerful. But anyway, why should the God debate matter to science? I like that question. I've been thinking about it since you asked it. Why should the God debate matter to science? Well, apparently it matters. You came here this evening. But it's a very important question, because if we're not careful, we can get a very distorted impression for this evening. For the vast majority of science that's done in your university here and elsewhere, the God question is, strictly speaking, irrelevant. If you are working on some biological organism and working out how it works, what are the enzymes, what are the biochemical pathways, you're not thinking at all about God, and quite rightly so. The place where the overlap comes is where you are thinking often about origins and existence and what science can point to. Now, one of the things I have been saying tonight, but I haven't crystallized it, is this. For me, one of the major arguments from a scientific perspective that there is a God is not the results of science, it's the fact we can do science. It has to do with that fundamental conviction of the rational intelligibility of the universe, which is part of the faith, and I say that word advisedly because Einstein used it, of all scientists. We have been duped into thinking that faith is a religious concept and it means believing where there's no evidence. That is doubly and seriously and tragically wrong. Faith that is believing in no evidence is blind faith and is very dangerous. And the new atheists are right to point to it. But the Christian faith, and I can only speak for the Christian faith, is not blind, it's evidence-based. That's why at its heart is the historic event of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it is a conviction based on evidence, and that is same as science. All scientists believe that the universe is rationally intelligible. You wouldn't do any science if you didn't believe it. And as Polkinghorne points out, science is powerless to explain its faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe, because you can't do any physics until you believe it. So why should it matter to science? I think it matters because people are concerned about who they are. And our identity is in part given to us by our past. A person who forgets their past, who has amnesia, often forgets who they are. You have to build up their identity by painstakingly clicking them back into their past experiences. Now, the big story that each of us search for, the meta-narrative of existence, and we're all looking for it. Walk into any bookshop and see the shelf space devoted to the origins of the universe. Why is there such interest? Because it's a story into which people claim that we can fit. This is our story. And why it matters is simply this, that many vocal people are arguing that science has the cultural authority to give us the essence of that story. And no other voice is allowed. That is scientism. And that, I think, is seriously defective. And that is why it matters, I think. It matters on the biggest question of all, who you think you are. Now, there are 4 more questions. I can't face, I can't face. I'd be delighted to spend another hour. I'm going to take what's common to them. And what's common to them is Richard Dawkins' knockdown argument in the book The God Delusion. If you claim, he will say, after I've finished all of this, and he said it to me, so I'm not telling tales out of school. If you claim that God created the universe, well, first of all, that's no explanation at all, because by definition, God is more complex than the universe you're explaining. Secondly, if you claim that God created the universe, then you'll have to logically ask who created God, and who created the God that created the God that created the God that created, and so on. It sounds brilliant, doesn't it? I think it's very silly, ladies and gentlemen. Let me analyze it briefly. God is no explanation at that ultimate level because he's more complex than what you're explaining. So I pick up a book, and it's called The God Delusion. It's 400 pages long. It's very complex. But then I discover that it emanates from the brain of one Richard Dawkins, which is infinitely more complex, at least I think he believes that, than the book itself. So therefore, by definition, that is no explanation, since the explanation is more complicated than the thing you're explaining. There's something wrong with that, isn't there? And Brian Davis, fellow of the Royal Society, is just a brilliant mathematician, has just written a book on beliefs in science. And he points out the elementary fact that explanations are often very much more complex than the thing you're explaining. And he imagines an attempt to explain a paper clip. It's very simple, isn't it? But if you're going to explain it completely, you have to go into steel making, paper, everything. You see, we've been bamboozled into thinking that explanation must inevitably be reductionist from the complex to the simple. Now, that is a very important methodology in science, that kind of methodological reductionism. But ontological reductionism will not do, because in many areas our explanation is more complex, and that is the fun of it. Incidentally, isn't it odd? Let me leave you with this little thing. Isn't it odd? You see, is there a beach at Dundee? I haven't determined that yet. There is a beach. Well, you go down to the beach in Dundee, and you see a few letters of your name in the sand. And you immediately infer upwards to intelligent causation, don't you? And then you go into the laboratory. There's a special laboratory at Oxford that hasn't been invented yet. And it's got a magic stereoscopic microscope in it. And through it you see a double helix uncoiling and spitting off letters C-G-A-T-T, C-G-A-A-T-C, G. 3.5 billion of them in exactly the right order, like a computer program. And you ask, well, what's the ultimate reason for that? Chance and necessity. What? Chance and the laws of nature, yes. It strikes me, ladies and gentlemen, there's something odd going on. How is it that 3 letters of our name in a language spell intelligence, and 3.5 billion letters in a code spell simply chance and necessity? Now, I'm not denying that chance and necessity do a great deal. That's not the point. It's the question of what is the text saying. But I haven't answered the question. Here it comes. Who created God? Well, if you ask the question, who created God, you're assuming that God was created, aren't you, by definition? But what if God wasn't created? Then the question falls. You see, hidden in the question is the assumption. If I suddenly find my wallet is gone this evening after I've finished speaking, and I say to you, who stole my wallet? Well, the assumption is that somebody's stolen it, but I might have just forgotten it. And my wife would tell me that's the most likely explanation. In other words, when you ask who created God, you have immediately closed down the range of possible explanations in terms of a created God. If Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God's Delusion, I suspect it wouldn't have sold many copies, because we don't need him or anybody else to tell us that created gods are a delusion. Ladies and gentlemen, the central claim of Christianity is that God already existed. The Word already was. He wasn't created. The universe was created. But then it's a wicked thing in me, but then I'm Irish, albeit of Scottish descent, ladies and gentlemen. But I did turn the question round on Richard Dawkins. I said, that question works both ways, Richard. You believe that it's legitimate to ask who created the Creator. Okay, let's try. You believe the universe created you. Who created your Creator? I'm still waiting for an answer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.